Hello, my name's Ken Westin. Thanks for having me here. Today I'm going to be talking about some research that I did a while back regarding some things I was finding with regards to hackers actually collaborating with white-collar criminals. Basically, the target was non-public information, so information that like earnings reports or information that can be used for an advantage when you're trading stock. I actually found some these folks collaborating in some underground markets, actually exchanging some of this information. Some of these groups were actually trying to get anyone that maybe works at some of these companies to also share this intelligence. And so as a result of that, I actually dug a little bit deeper, and I actually found that there were a few cases of this, and some of them actually were able to generate quite a bit of money. One group in particular generated around $30 million. I'll talk a little bit about that and how they did it. So there might be two different groups here. There might be, one side of it is you may learn some things about why you want to be protecting this information. If you're on the criminal side, you'll be learning some things of how not to get caught. Because these guys, they tend to do some kind of stupid things, and that's what ends up getting them busted. So just a little bit about me. I've been in security and technology for the last 20 years. I've been with Splunk for about almost 3.5 years now. I'm now staff security strategist based in Portland, Oregon. I'm trained in both offensive and defensive security, and I've actually put bad people in jail with data. Before I was actually at Splunk, I was actually developing various tools and technologies that were tracking criminals. I actually worked with law enforcement and actually put some various organized crime groups away. I am also a guitar and record hoarder, so I really like music, so that's my hobby. I'm also a tech editor for a pretty good book. If there's anyone out there, maybe your family or someone at your work that wants to understand Bitcoin, it was a book called Bitcoin for Nonmathematicians. It's kind of interesting in this too. I actually found that there was a lot of cryptocurrency that was being utilized for some of these trades. So they would give Bitcoin, and in exchange they would get some of these stolen earnings reports, for example. So a lot of people ask me why this particular topic. I think it's fascinating because it touches on a lot of different disciplines. So we're talking about criminal hacking. You'll see elements of fraud, insider trading, insider threat, cryptocurrency, dark nets, a lot of international intrigue. You'll see that there's a lot of this activity is actually happening internationally. It's also a significant threat to our economy. Some of these folks that did get caught, they got caught because they got greedy or they did something stupid. I've actually found that, and these guys, some of them were doing this for 4 to 5 years before they actually got caught. So I think that there's a lot more of this actually happening, and so a lot of folks are actually generating quite a bit of money as a result of that. I think it's just the tip of the iceberg, and I really like this too from where I am at Splunk. We get to deal with a lot of different data. This is where I get to actually work with a lot of different disparate data sets, not just your traditional security data sets, but also looking at stock trades, any sort of inconsistencies there or anomalies, or some other ideas where you can actually correlate log sources across different organizations, right, that maybe they don't have before. I really like this concept. This is Edmond Lacard. So he was sort of the grandfather of forensic science. They used to call him the French Sherlock Holmes. He actually developed the first forensic crime lab in France. This is before DNA, before fingerprints or anything like that. But there was this concept that he devised called every contact leaves a trace. Of course, he was referring to physical crimes. The idea is that when you commit a murder, you leave something there and you also take something with you. Right? I believe this carries over into the cyber world as well. It's just a matter of ensuring we actually have the right tools in place to log that, or if we know where to look. So there's two key vulnerabilities for criminals and how they get caught. We always talk about vulnerabilities of systems, but criminals themselves, what do you guys think are the two vulnerabilities that leads to criminals being caught, particularly in the cyberspace? Yeah. Bragging. Bragging, exactly. Arrogance, right? Arrogance and greed. Those are the two things that usually end up getting them caught. Particularly if they find something that's lucrative, they make some money, and then they extend themselves and they go a little bit further, and it puts them a little bit more at risk. So you'll see a pretty good example of that in a bit here. So one thing I have found is that what's really interesting is that a lot of financial folks have been interested in cryptocurrency. particularly when Bitcoin was fairly high. We actually had a lot of like traders that were actually trading in Bitcoin as well. So I actually believe that when you see the stock market fall, you also are going to see Bitcoin fall because people are selling to cover some other investments. But I actually saw a lot more of this happening where financial folks, not only were they interested in cryptocurrency, but they also started going into Tor, going into some of these underground markets and forums. Now what happens here is that some of these folks that are really savvy on the financial side are now able to collaborate almost anonymously with people that are more technical on the hacker side. And that's kind of what the perfect storm as the result of this. I actually found one forum on the darknet where it was actually trying to get information on non-public data. They would actually share some of the profit. They would actually pay you for it. So if you work for a particular company and you have some earnings reports and you provide it to this group and they trade on that, they'll actually give you a cryptocurrency in return, right? Again, it's all anonymous. It's very, very difficult to track this type of activity. So I deal a lot with insider threat. I do a hands-on workshop around that at Splunk. I'm actually a certified insider threat program manager as well. So this has been something I've started to research a little bit deeper as well. I actually see this one post. This guy seems like he really knew what he was doing. He also had some connections. This was actually a forum post in one of these darknet forums. Maybe I'm coming a bit late to the post. Anyway, I work inside a major Wall Street company that does millions of trades a day. I have access to DMS, high clearance, and access to all North America, Europe, and Brazil. I won't disclose anything else. If you have good info, I offer 50-50, and I can give you hard cash or Bitcoin, no paper trail. So kind of proves my theory here. Only relevant information, please. I found another forum, and this one, in order for you to join, you actually have to commit a crime. You have to provide them with non-public information that they can trade on. Once they successfully trade on that, then they'll let you in. I think this was a honeypot set up by law enforcement. I just have this theory, this weird feeling about it. It's a great way to do it. But there's a number of these out there. If you look on the darknet forums, you'll actually find a lot of these sort of insider trading types of communications that are happening. So what's interesting is that when you think about insider trading, and it was by definition of the SEC, there's a lot of things that go into that. In order for it to be insider trading, or at least this is the way it used to be, you have to have some sort of fiduciary duty to that organization. Now, if you're a hacker and you're targeting this type of information, do you have a fiduciary duty to that organization? No. This is a situation where the law did not keep up with the times, right? So, key there is a fiduciary duty. So the first case I actually saw was this, was the SEC versus Dorozhko. This fellow, Dorozhko, he ended up getting caught because he did a really stupid thing. He got greedy. He took basically, he's in Eastern Europe, basically took an entire year's salary, never traded stocks before in his life, and he opened up a brokerage account and he did a put for $42,000, right? This is one of those things that will raise the flag with the SEC. There's all sorts of triggers, and this is one of them. He was able to then make over $286,000. Because there was a flag, this got held up. They did some more research, and what actually he was doing is he was targeting a web application that did Thomson Financial. Now, with Thomson Financial, what they'll do is they provide a platform for companies to share with investors. Like when they're going to do their earnings reports, this is where they would do it, sort of like a webcast type of thing. So what he actually found was a vulnerability, and he was monitoring a particular directory, and once this happened, then he was able to download that information before anyone else. And it was actually from this IMS Health Incorporated company. He took that information, and the timestamps all fit this perfectly. He did the trade, and that's how he was able to generate that much money so quickly. So he also tried to spoof his IP address, but a few times he actually connected from his actual real IP address, right? So if you are doing any sort of this activity, make sure that you're covering your tracks a little bit better. So the summary judgment was for the $286,000 and then $7,000. He never actually appeared in court. They actually just took the money out of that brokerage account. I think he still owes them $7,000. But he didn't owe any sort of fiduciary duty to the source of the information. So he wasn't actually liable for insider trading, and that's something that could have actually got him, he would have been assigned jail time. As a result of this, they actually put a new rule in. It was Rule 10b-5-2, and actually says, clarifies this. So even if you are not, an officer of the company and you have access to this information, this can now be considered insider trading. They've even now referred to this as outsider trading. So this was a really big case. This got really interesting. There was a group of hackers that actually started to specifically target this kind of information. What they wanted to go after was PR firms. So PR firms have access to this type of information if there's going to be earnings reports, things like that. Companies, they have it, so they have early access to this data before they actually get delivered. So there was a group of hackers, and then there was also a group of traders. And it's really interesting how they were able to actually communicate. It was actually exactly what I just mentioned. They actually found each other in a forum. And they started actually discussing it. Some people got rich off of this, and then they extended that trading network as well. The interesting thing here is this happened over the course of 4 years, right? So these guys did this for 4 years before anything got caught. And again, it was because someone got greedy. Actually, one of the guys, one of the hackers, he was doing a lot of other hacking. Actually, there's 2 guys that are involved in this, you'll see. But one of them, he was getting involved in stolen credit cards. And the Ukrainian police actually worked with US law enforcement to go in, and they confiscated his laptop. Now, this whole trading scheme would never have been discovered if that laptop was not confiscated, because it's when they actually went into that particular laptop that they were actually able to find all of the stuff that was actually happening, because this guy actually made videos of how to go about and collect some of this information from this server that he'd set up, and it's pretty funny. So the first one that they targeted was MarketWired. They actually did SQL injection. We were able to establish some reverse shells. They were able to get some of the internal login credentials. What's interesting is that MarketWired had no idea. They didn't have the right logging in place, so even when law enforcement came to them, they couldn't tell them a lot of the information. They were able to get this mostly from one of the hackers' laptops. They downloaded over 100,000 press releases over the course of 4 years. Then what they did is they uploaded this to a server, and they actually did it as a hidden server. And then they started marketing the wares. And they said, I think it was like $6,000 to get access to this data. And there were traders that were watching this, and they paid for it, in Bitcoin, and they suddenly had access to all these press releases. Then they kept doing this for over 4 years, and then the traders also started creating brokerage accounts for the hackers, because the hackers wanted in on this as well. So they did this through a bunch of shell companies. They were doing all sorts of interesting things on the white-collar crime side. Again, they would have avoided detection if it wasn't for that one laptop getting caught. And then they got greedy again. They targeted another firm. This was PR Newswire. And this one they actually were in 3 different times. They were able to get in once. They got booted out. They got in again, and they actually installed some malware. And then they got booted out again. And then this time they actually bought a huge trove of passwords from social media. And they were actually able to map some of the people that work for that company to the social media accounts. And I know this never happens, but apparently they were using the same password, right? So this stuff actually happens in real life, right? So that's how they were able to get in, and then they were doing it for quite a while before they were detected. Then they went to a Business Newswire, and some of these underground forums, these guys were making a bit of a name for themselves because they were making a lot of money. And one guy actually approached him. He said, "Look, I actually have access to one of these newswires. I'll just sell the access to you because I don't want to get involved in any of this trading stuff." And so they just basically bought access to another newswire. So they had access to 3 different newswires, and that's where they're downloading all these different press releases as a result of that. Now, the traders were really smart too. These guys were savvy. In fact, one of them was actually a former VP at Morgan Stanley, right? So he really knew what they were doing. They knew how to do trades and how to make it so that it wouldn't trigger any sort of SEC flags. They were doing small micro trades. They created multiple accounts. They created shell companies that would be tied to some of these accounts as well. So it was very difficult for them to track. They made over $30 million in trades, right? So if you're a criminal hacker and you're messing with ransomware and stolen credit cards and things like that, that is not where you're going to be making the money. If you want to make the big bucks, start targeting this kind of data. I'm just kidding. Don't go into crime. What's interesting too is that some of the hackers, they actually were logging into some of these brokerage accounts as well, and they actually would forget to turn off some of their proxies, VPNs, so they would actually see the same IP addresses on the newswires that they were actually seeing in some of the brokerage accounts. So this is a really interesting case when they're actually doing the investigation, where they're actually correlating logs from all these different organizations and putting this puzzle together, which that's the kind of investigation I'm always really interested in. I find that kind of thing to be rather fascinating. This is sort of a ledger of their actual trades that they were making. So you'll see that, again, they're not really huge ones, maybe $42,000 here and there. They're not placing any sort of big bets. This wouldn't raise any sort of suspicion. But if you do this in a lot of different brokerage accounts and you have shadow companies and things like that, you're able to hide some of your identity. So one of the traders, he ended up getting arrested. He was sort of the leader. This is Vitaly. He's the one that was actually a former VP at Morgan Stanley. So he really knew what he was doing. Again, they think he netted 17.5 million. It could be even more than that. He said he was innocent. He was also a minister at a church, right? So yeah, his church actually did a fundraiser for him to help with his legal bills. It was great. They even showed up in court for him. We believe you. You're innocent. He actually just got tried this last summer, and he was found guilty on all accounts. I'm still not sure what he's being sentenced for, but he's going to be in jail for a long time. So just on the summary of this is that, this is really interesting. Those, some of the data sources that were available. You have some of the online brokerage accounts. You have application logs, looking at user data, IP, stuff like that. Some of the bank records, business registry data, Newswire user authentication of VPN logs. The forensic image of Elemivich's computer was huge, because he actually did have a video there that he was giving to the trader showing them how to download the files from the server, and it had all the information right there. So again, if you're committing these types of crimes, try not to keep the evidence on your laptop, right? And then some of the tools too were compromised credentials. It's interesting, a lot of these PR firms, it looks like they didn't have multi-factor authentication at the time. Malware, SQL injection. Some of the organizations had lack of appropriate logging, and the hackers took advantage of that. Of course, Tor and proxies. But what's really interesting about this is it goes even deeper. Do you think they stopped with PR firms? When you're making millions of dollars off this, right? Are you going to stop there? No. They got arrogant and greedy, right? So, again, remember that from I said earlier, right? Vulnerable criminals, what gets caught? Arrogance and greed. Before I did this presentation once, another case I had was that the SEC themselves, they have a database where they actually company have to file some information. They actually got hacked. What happened though, they were really quiet about it. There wasn't a lot of information about how that particular hack happened. So this is basically the slide. I kind of talked a little bit about it. They did disclose that some non-public information was compromised, and it was probably being used for illegal trades. The organization actually had some prior issues, some security issues with some encryption. But what really is interesting is one of the hackers that was actually involved in the PR firm is actually one of the guys that was involved in this. He kind of went off on his own. This was actually just announced about a few months ago. He actually went on his own. His name is Eremenko. His hacker name is Lamarez. So he does a lot of other interesting things. But he was able to actually sending phishing emails to SEC employees. He made it look like he was coming from the security team. These documents had malware in them. He was able to then compromise his credentials and get access to these systems. He was able to get quite a few credentials. One of them was to the SEC and the test database. So what he did then is he was doing this. There was a few trades where he was gathering some of this information. And then what do you do when you find some tool that, or a process that, it's going to generate a lot of revenue for you? You want to automate that, right? So he actually automated this whole process. He actually had what he referred to as the exfiltration machine. And that would actually be a server that would log in to keep checking for any new posts that were sent. And then he would automate the process of sending that information to some of these traders that he was working with. Some of the traders that were involved in some of the PR Newswire were also involved in this one, as well as some additional. I think there was like 3 or 4 other folks that were actually brought into this particular scheme as well. They didn't make quite as much money. This is kind of what they announced. It's probably around $4 million or so, but you know, that's not too bad for, you know, about a year's worth of work. This happened around 2016 too, which I was kind of surprised to hear. There was a lot of connections that he was making coming from a server in Romania. A lot of the infrastructure that he was using for the PR Newswire was also being utilized for the SEC. What's interesting is, you know, why didn't they kind of tie some of this together? But it took them a little while to be able to do that. If you have a Romanian IP address logging in repeatedly into a sensitive database, that might be something that you want to pay attention to, right? And this is kind of what their trades look like. It was interesting just looking at their kind of what their trading patterns look like before they had access to the data, right? 'Cause they wanted to be able to show that, hey, if they were in court and they say, well, I didn't use that data, I just really know what I'm doing. They actually were able to go back historically to look at how well they were doing on their stock trades, and most of them were not doing very well. And then when they started getting access to this data, and now all of a sudden they started winning and getting a lot of revenue. So yeah, that's another anomaly, right? It's another data source that we can leverage for an investigation like this. So another type of organization that was targeted is legal firms. So this kind of might start seeing a pattern here. It's not necessarily the organizations themselves that are going to be targeted. You think about some of the service providers, right? Think about supply chain. So legal firms, you're going to see like PR firms, these sort of satellite folks that have access to some of this data. So there was another one. This was some folks that were actually in China. These guys were really interesting because they actually had a full business plan. When they actually were working on this case, they got their laptop. There was actually a PowerPoint deck where they were actually walking through how they were going to conduct this type of fraud. And there was a number of different emails too, and that they were exchanging. So it's another thing if you're committing this type of crime, don't have a PowerPoint deck explaining how you're going about and committing a crime. It's bad news. So the first one they did, they targeted a law firm. It was in 2014. They were targeting the email systems, and that's where they were able to get access to. They were able to see what emails the lawyers were sending. They were looking for any sort of information that might help them, looking for things like mergers and acquisitions in particular. Most of the law firms that were targeted were in New York. They really knew how and who to target, and some of these law firms were actually representing very large companies. That's how they were able to get access to this. One was the Roche acquisition of Intermune. Another one was the Intel acquisition of a company called Altera. They were actually able to take this information and trade on it and make quite a bit of money. They did another one in April 2015, this time another different law firm. It's when it was the Pitney Bowes acquisition of Borderline. And then they actually created a number of brokerage accounts, and they netted about $3 million. That's it's quite a bit of money, I mean, to make over 2 years, right? So that's really helpful. And then this is their trades and how much they made. You'll see that there's one person, this is how much they made, and then they also charge them interest on that. And there's a civil penalty that goes along with that as well. And you'll see one of them didn't have a civil penalty associated with it. So the reason for that is because that is actually one of the other guy's mom. He actually created a brokerage account for his mom, and he invested in it, and so she can make a lot of money. Luckily, she didn't get a criminal record because she had no idea that her son was involved in the crime. But wouldn't that suck that you all of a sudden you have all this money and you come to find out you don't get to keep it? There was another group that was targeting, it was the Fin4 group, primarily spear phishing campaigns. And the goal again was to compromise credentials for email accounts. That time, this one, they were targeting pharmaceutical companies. What they were looking for is information maybe on like FDA approvals and things like that. If a particular drug is going to be approved, that's going to increase that company's revenue, and of course the stock is going to skyrocket. So that's what they were really looking for. So some of the things I was looking at, how some of these traders actually get, are they monitored? So if you are trading stocks during the day, there's a lot of monitoring that takes place. They'll even monitor any of your Skype conversations and things like that, but they don't necessarily monitor anything outside of that. So when you go home, they're not monitoring your cell phone or anything like that. So some of these groups, some of these folks are actually pretty savvy about using some clandestine communications. There was a case where a guy named Daniel Rivas, he actually worked at Bank of America. He's working on an IT project, and he basically had access to this huge database of information about these companies, particularly things that were around mergers and acquisitions. Now, he's not a trader himself, didn't really know anything about that, but he had a new girlfriend. She did, and her father was a huge trader. He really knew what he was doing. He actually managed a huge fund. So what he actually did is they started writing they look like love notes to his girlfriend, but it was kind of a code, and he was able to send that. She was then give that to her father, and then her father would be able to say, yes, I need to buy this stock at this time, right, as a result of that. Pretty good setup. You know, they would not have gotten caught. Like, there was no way, because there was no real digital trail. But guess what happened? Got greedy and arrogant. James Moody, he also got one of his other buddies involved in this, and he was helping them, gave him some of this data. But then one of Daniel's friends, he actually was having some financial difficulties. So he helped him out, so he started giving him some of this information. They started trading on it. This time they started using I can't remember, they didn't say specifically what chat app, but it was like a time-bombed encrypted chat app. The problem is, one of them, Daniel, would delete those messages, but his friends didn't. So when the police confiscated the phone, they were actually able to see some of those communications, and they were able to identify the whole scheme. So kind of thinking about this is, what is the target of this, if you're targeting non-public data? So you're looking at things like earnings reports. It can be patent information, any sort of M&A activity, FDA status. That's like we saw with the pharma. Vulnerabilities. I think if you identify a vulnerability in the iPhone or a system, and you know that before anyone else, that might have an impact on the stock as well, right? So hackers out there, you might have a way to make some money, or breaches. Remember when Equifax happened, there was some interesting things that occurred. There was a bunch of the executives had sold some stock before it was actually announced, right? So what they actually found was that wasn't criminal because it was actually scheduled beforehand, right? They actually go through that process, except for one guy that actually was, he worked as one of the CTOs for the organization. He found out about it, and he actually went and he sold a bunch of his stock, and he got busted for insider trading, and he's spending some time in jail. So some of the organizations, too, I would also say like manufacturing yields, so even on the factories. So if I can tell how much product they're actually making, that could give me an idea of revenues. So if I target a factory, think about IoT security, any sort of formulas, right? Maybe I want to get the Coke formula, right? Like that could be useful information. But some of the organizations that are going to be targeted are your legal firms. You're going to have your M&A firms, PR firms, investor relations, factories. I even think the security teams, right, for the breaches and vulnerabilities. And then also look at the company. Who has access to some of this data? I would look at HR, legal, marketing, right? They have access to a lot of this data, and they might be targeted as well. So I think it's really important to make sure that we're actually logging all the things. A lot of times, organizations, they may just be logging things on the firewall level, but I believe that there is relevant security, a good reason to have security data for anything, right? So I think any sort of application, web application or anything like that, you at least want to be logging your authentication logs and keeping an eye on that, IP addresses. That's going to be really valuable information. And not just the technical data sources, but really think about non-technical data sources. So it can be everything like personnel records and things like that. I was actually on site with a customer this week, and we were working on an insider threat scenario, and there was a situation that one of the employees, he made maybe $55,000, $60,000 a year, and all of a sudden he pulled up in a brand new Tesla, and his friends were really impressed with this, and they were trying to figure out how he was making some of that money. Come to find out, he was actually taking some data from the company and was actually selling it to a competitor. So that's pretty brazen. So if you were doing this type of crime and you don't have that type of income level, right, hold on to your cash and don't go buying Teslas to raise red flags. I think that's how the guy from the Silk Road got caught too. He ended up buying a Tesla. He shouldn't be able to afford it, right? So I do a lot with insider threat. I actually stole this from, he was actually a former CTO at the FBI. You guys are probably familiar with the Lockheed Martin kill chain. So that's a little bit different when you're dealing with insiders. So someone that might be wanting to sell this type of information. So this is actually what they used for actually investigating agents, right? This kind of mindset. Because there's usually this sort of recruitment and tipping point, and that can be a situation where it could be a financial situation, a lot of times marital status, things like that can trigger some of this stuff. It can also be a situation where someone's mad at the organization. Maybe they got passed over for a promotion, or maybe they've had disciplinary action, right? So I work with organizations to actually kind of facilitate the communication with HR and the security teams to at least start creating watch lists, right? And maybe have more verbose logging for those particular users in our environment. Just because they're going through a hard time doesn't necessarily mean they're malicious, but if they have escalated privileges, I want to maybe keep a closer eye on those folks. They're a higher risk to my organization than maybe some of the other ones. Then they'll actually conduct a search and recon. So what data do I actually have access to? Can I actually get access to the investor relations server? Let me see. Maybe my user credentials will give me access to that. Sometimes they won't. Any other information that I might be able to access that I could sell. Then they'll actually do the acquisition and collection. So the search and recon side of it, as well as the acquisition and collection, that's an area where a lot of times you can detect this, either using DLP or at least monitoring the authentication of some of these systems. Sorry, getting over a cold. Great. So so and then before they can actually do some damage. So I deal a lot with other weird cases too, where it can be something where they actually systems, things like that, or sabotage, right? There's other types of actions that they might be able to take. So, and that's pretty much it. I kind of went through this really quickly. I apologize, but so if you guys have any questions, ideas, or stock tips, feel free to email me. This is my contact information. And do you guys have any questions? Any questions? Cool. Well, thanks again for having me. Oh, question in the back. Yeah. Splunk. We're publicly traded. We're doing pretty good this year. So great. Well, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. So is this the first Salt Lake City B-Sides? Okay. Well, it's the first time I've been here, so it's great. Thanks for having me. I'm going to go drink some High West whiskey.